Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, depending where you are. Welcome to this Central Asia program online seminar at the George Washington University. My name is Marlène Laruelle. I'm the director of the Central Asia program and of the Institute. And it's my great pleasure to receive you today for this really wonderful events commemorating the Perestroika time in Central Asia. This event is part of our event series celebrating the 30th anniversary of Central Asia independence. We are also celebrating the 60th anniversary of our institute, which means that we have an old institute dating from the time of the Sino-Soviet period, but we are here to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the independence of Central Asia, and that's really what brings us all together. And we were discussing the themes we wanted to have, that really these perestroika years are absolutely critical if we want to understand the post-Soviet period. But unfortunately, the academic production on the perestroika period has been relatively limited. It's growing now, and we will be discussing that. So I'm very grateful to Artemy Kalinovsky, who has been organizing this event and who will present you the whole roundtable. But I wanted to just say that it's a big honor for us to receive such important perestroika figures such as Davlat, Khudonazarov, Ambassador Zamira, Sydykova. So we are very grateful for you to be here. Before giving the floor to Artemy, just a little housekeeping information. This event is bilingual, English and Russian, and we have a translator here. So if you don't do anything, you will be listening people both in English and in Russian, depending on the language in which they are talking. If you want to shift to the English translation when someone will be speaking in Russian, you need to click on the little globe that you see on your computer, where it's written interpretation, and you select the English channel. If you want to hear everything in Russian, including those speaking in English being translated in Russian, you click to the Russian button. So please make a selection, or if you stay off interpretation, you will hear people in the language they are talking, so both English and Russian. With that, let me give the floor to Artemy Kalinovsky, who is professor of Russian, Soviet, and post-Soviet studies at Temple University and principal investigator of a European Research Council funded project on building a better tomorrow, development knowledge and practice in Central Asia and beyond, based at the University of Amsterdam. And as many of you know, Artemy has been publishing a lot on late Soviet period, perestroika time. And so it's really a great pleasure to have him here. And I will now give him the floor so he can introduce our speakers. Artemy, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Many thanks to Marlène for coming up with this initiative and hosting us here today. And enormous thanks to Ambassador Sydykova, Davlat, Khudonazarov, and Isaac Scarborough for joining us for this discussion. It was roughly 30 years ago that the republics of Central Asia declared independence from the USSR. The Union had not yet collapsed, and the legislative bodies where these votes had taken place were part of the Soviet constitutional order. Negotiations on preserving the Union in some form would still continue for some months. Nevertheless, with even the most staunch opponents of reform moving to the independence camp, it was clear by October 1st, 1991, that the old order could not simply be preserved. Before these official proclamations of independence, however, were several years of political debate and contestation that played out in the press, in university auditoriums, and on public squares. These developments have been made possible by the policies of glasnost, openness, proclaimed in Moscow under Mikhail Gorbachev. But the content of these discussions, debates, and programs for reform were shaped by local activists, some drawn from the party or communist youth movement, others from among the broader ranks of students, artists, intellectuals, and so on. Today, we've asked two participants in those events to think back and reflect on the days before independence. So on this period when there were a number of futures being discussed and a number of futures that seemed possible. Since their biographies are provided in the invitation, and our time is limited, I will just give a very brief introduction. Zamira Sydykova was Kyrgyz ambassador to the United States and Canada after a career as an opposition journalist. Davlat Khudonazarov is a filmmaker known for his feature and documentary films, and he's also a historian, human rights activist, and a public figure, and was a People's Deputy of the USSR and a member of the Interregional Group of Deputies. And Isaac Scarborough is a university lecturer in Russian studies at Leiden University and a postdoctoral fellow at Liverpool John Moores University, and the author of a forthcoming book, Moscow's Heavy Shadow, The Violent Collapse of the USSR. All three of them, and of course, especially Ambassador Sydykova and Davlat Khudonazarov, have very long CVs, which I encourage you to find online. Here are some questions that I've asked Ambassador Sydykova and Mr. Khudonazarov to address in their initial presentations. What made you become politically active at the time? To what extent did you see your activity as reforming the system? At what point, if any, did you start thinking about moving beyond the Soviet system? How did you experience the fractures within your republics? Were they primarily generational, social, or ethnic? And how important for you were interactions with individuals outside of your republic? These are, of course, just starting points, and both speakers are free to touch on whatever issues they think are most important. And I'll then ask Isaac to link those comments to recent academic debates on Perestroika in Central Asia, and maybe pose some more questions for everybody to consider. After that, I'll give Ambassador Sydykova and Mr. Khudonazarov a brief chance to respond if they wish to do so, before we open it out to questions and answers, Q&A. And I believe the procedure is that we'll ask you to post the questions in the chat box, and I will then read them out to participants. So thanks again, everybody, for joining us. And I'd like to give the first word to Ambassador Sydykova. So about 10 minutes.
У меня прямо в этот момент стал разряжаться компьютер. Сейчас, секундочку. Вы знаете, я могу уже начать рассказывать, потому что для меня это было очень, как это говорится, exciting, вообще period of time. Я училась в Москве на факультете журналистики в Московском государственном университете с 81 по 86 год. И вот как раз в это время началась гласность и перестройка. И я зачитывалась литературной газетой, и вообще в университете все это бродило, все это как-то вот очень обсуждалось, белые пятна истории.
The white spots in the history, everything was very interesting and unusual. I've heard lectures, and I've been listening to lectures of Zasursky and other foreign professors who were talking about history of Russian, Soviet at that time, journalism and foreign journalism, capitalist journalism, they would say. And now when we think about this, and when we think about the history in the past, with my colleagues of the same generation, I keep saying I feel like I am from that period too, and I understand your nostalgia, right, as a child of that time. But I can say that I don't really feel myself as a nostalgic person toward that time, because I remember that excitement that I experienced. And when I came back to Kyrgyzstan at that time, and I ended up in a period that many call, it was a very difficult time to dismantle the Soviet Union. So especially Central Asia, and particularly Kyrgyzstan, was different from many other places, because Kyrgyzstan was the first country after the Baltic countries in 89 and 90 start developing a very active national movement. It was called the National Free Movement, that really started putting out the slogans about the independence and the national identity, that we really need to get the sovereignty And first of all, it's a language sovereignty, and we really need to think about finding the ways of sustainability and self-sovereignty. And there were large groups of young people who were really coming from the mountains to the capital. I remember that very well. And they started to kind of settle in the land around the capital Bishkek, and their first demand to the back Soviet power in Kyrgyzstan. So the demands were, we also want this access to all those benefits that people have here in the capital, who most of the time, Russian national people who live there. And I don't necessarily talk about this in one way or the other. It was in some ways probably considered a nationalistic movement, but the idea was that this access to education, access to work, access to opportunities were available more for people who were Russians and who knew Russian, rather than people who live in small towns and people who speak Kyrgyz. And for them, their kind of mission was to just do work on producing agriculture, and that's it. And so these people started to come closer to capital. They started to settle in the land around the capital and started coming into the capital to protest. And what now is called the White House in our power, but at that point, in that time, it was the building where the Soviet Kyrgyz authorities were housed. And to this day, let's say, these people and characters and heroes who participated in this protest, they're still there. And when I come and meet with them, I keep talking about this because I myself want to understand what it means. I myself from Bishkek, my parents grew up there, I grew up there, and we worked there, and we did have that access to everything that was in the capital and that whatever the capital has to offer. So we really wanted to understand why they came at that point, and why, for example, they didn't feel that the balance was there, and perhaps they really had this difficulty understanding that. And we remember at that time it was quite a nationalistic movement in Kyrgyzstan, and a lot of people worried about that. And we really wanted to understand that. So in our case, it was quite a smooth transition, because we actually excluded the representative of the Communist Party from Kyrgyzstan back in 1990, before the Soviet was. And again, in October in 1991, again, before the official dismantle of Soviet Union, our movement asked for removal of the secretary of the Communist Party, and that we have to select the president, and we have to declare an independent Kyrgyzstan state. And that was happened, and that's what happened in our case in 1990. And after that, already the Central Committee of the Communist Party, they kind of became outsiders, I would say. They were very quiet in the ground, and I wouldn't say that it was completely kind of opening up everything and allowing the sovereignty, but I would say that it was really a nice, quiet time. And Gorbachev, as you may remember, also started feeling that if the confrontation continues, it may bring a lot of the big fights, and that was not something that wanted. And you remember that Chingiz Akhmatov at the time, a famous writer, was in the group of Sakharov, and he was talking about this unbalance in the communist ideology. He was really very active and vocal about that. And at the time when this movement was happening in Bishkek, Gorbachev invited Chingiz Akhmatov, and he asked whether Chingiz Akhmatov wanted to go there to Kyrgyzstan and discuss that with the movement. Maybe let's see how that development of this choosing of president would be. How about you, Chingiz, would go and become the leader of this country, and we'll see how that works. And Chingiz at that time, Chingiz Ahmadov said no, and he instead offered another person who was also in a group of Sakharov, and that's how that Agayev came to the square where the movement, the nationalist movement was, who demanded for the independence of Kyrgyzstan, and who wanted to break free from the Soviet party authorities. And our local committee in Kyrgyzstan was also very supportive of these meetings and of that movement at the time. They were meeting, and we also had the democratic movement inside, among the Democrats as well. We had about 14 deputies who offered and joined these movements. And we really had a very soft, if you wish, landing, and we had a very smooth transition, and we're very much proud of that.
We'll want to come back to, but I'll give the floor now to Davlat Khudonazarov. Вам надо включить микрофон, Давлат.
Время это было удивительное, и сейчас по
Khudonazarov. And now, 30 years later, I think, was it real and was it not? At that time, I was... So Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev came as a leader at that time, and maybe the overall mood from his speech came to all the corners of the Soviet Union. It's hard to say, but in the beginning of February of 1986, I think, one evening, I got a call, and my colleague, producer and filmmaker, who is older, asked me to come out and to talk. And I said, no, please come to my house. No, I wouldn't come in, please come out. Okay, I said. So I came out, and 3 of my colleagues was there, Anvar Turayev, a member of a union of filmmakers. And we had to have this big festival of filmmakers of Tajikistan the next day. And he was going to, and he said, we're going to offer your candidacy to be a chairperson of this union of filmmakers. Please, we ask you not to take your candidacy away. I started saying, no, I can't really do it. I have to do this film. I have this other work that I need to get done. We're waiting for some other things. No. If you say no, he said, you will not be able to be our friend anymore. So I gave a word that I will not take my candidacy and will agree to be on the ballot. And so when this conference started of all filmmakers of Tajikistan, and we got to this last point of electing the new leadership, my candidacy was offered. And I said that I would be okay with being a candidate. So the secretary of the Central Committee announced a weekend. So he said she's going to take a day off. So the conference actually stopped for 2 days as days off. And during these 2 days, they were talking with all the members of the Union of Filmmakers so they could vote against me. So there was this conversation to vote against me for these 2 days. What happened during those 2 days, I'm not sure what exactly happened, except that I know that they've been talking about it. That's what I've heard from others. They've been participating in different discussions. And then after 2 days, everybody got together again. And then they offered, no, at first we need to select and elect the leadership, and then leadership will select the chairman. So we need to select the members of the leadership, and then this group will select the chair. But at the end, nonetheless, I still became a chair of this union. So why do I say this story? This was the kind of a introduction, if you wish, to my next actions that I took. Artyom asked the question, which motivations we used and how we decided to do it. So in my case, this was really directly connected to this event. The fact that I was feeling this trust of people at very different levels. And in the very beginning, it was just the Union of Filmmakers in the country. So perhaps my before Perestroika life was so that it prepared me to that particular time. And I was the person who has to act in this time. Even though I didn't really have ambitions at the time to have big ambitions to have a leadership position. So I really didn't have any glimpse or ideas that somebody was talking about that I might become a member of a central committee of the Communist Party. I really didn't have any of those ideas that came to me. So, and I didn't really know that it would be so not difficult, I'd say, to get to such a high central committee in the country. We can see that because I think, activity and my work started from the very fact that my first, for example, diploma work was closed. It was censored. It was very pro-Soviet movie, by the way, but it was deemed to be anti-Soviet for some reason. I really never had any anti-Soviet films, not then, not now, but it was just pressure on the empty spot. It was this pressure that really built, and that pressure completely formed me as the person and as an individual. If people give you the award, and their highest award is trust, so you have to make sure that you support and really sustain their trust, because if they put you in that place, you have to do the maximum you can and possibly can be done. And that's how it continued. When the time came and the elections came to elect national deputies, the same kind of idea was driven, even though it was 1989, so that was already the 4th year of Perestroika, the 4th year as Gorbachev came to power. I was nominated. Again, there I also was trying to say no, because this public work, it really took a lot of time out of my professional life, and so it was impossible really at that point anymore to make movies. But that same way, the director of that school where I studied a long time ago, when I told him, no, I think you have people who are more might be interested and useful, he said, well, why do you come? Please go and please make it happen. So it ended up so that I agreed to be the candidate. And here from Dushanbe, at the same time, the whole delegation was sent to really pre-orient, if you wish, those who were electing this chair. And again, the more pressures were to not select me, not to elect me, the more people wanted to elect for me. So it was very interesting. And the story ended up that I was the chair of the Union of Filmmakers of the USSR. And so that's how I ended up being in that leadership position. So when I was in this leadership roles on the verge of a collapse of the Soviet Union, and as I was on this last meeting of the Communist Party, I was also very surprised that even in the Central Committee of Communist Party in this last meeting, I can say that the Central Asian republics, they were not really going to really seek independence. I think the fact that they wanted to say that they're independent did not necessarily mean at the time that they wanted to dismantle Soviet Union. I think this idea of dismantling of Soviet Union really happened in the Belaverska Push in that time when this three behind Gorbachev who got together and decided to dismantle the Soviet Union. I wouldn't say that this Central Asian republics really were making that push at the time at the last meeting of the Communist Party. And of course, this putsch situation didn't help. When Gorbachev came back to Moscow after the putsch has happened, he did not have that power anymore as the leader of the country as he used to have. And he was not really in a position to really make something serious, do something serious and really be respected and be at the level of the leader. So I don't think I don't think it was impossible to avoid. I think the tragedy is that the history of our country, and I say our country, I am in Russia right now, but for me, Soviet Union is and was and still is my big native land, if you wish. And kind of, I think about this native land as, you know, Alexander II, who dismantled free the people of Russia, and that ended up being a bad sign for him, and he was killed as after the fact that he freed people. So I think it's interesting that Gorbachev was the one who really gave people freedom, real freedom, true freedom. 2-3 years even before his coming to power, nobody could even dream about this opportunity, or nobody even could dream about a different atmosphere. And the fact that he was able to do it, or the fact that I, for example, became a deputy, that I was the chairman of Union of Filmmakers, that was only specifically because of the fact that Gorbachev was in Moscow, and it was possible to really appeal to him with this new ideas, if you wish. And I would also say that after the conference of the Union of Filmmakers in Tajikistan, there was a very famous fifth conference of filmmakers of the Soviet Union, and Klimov was selected and elected as a chairman. And that atmosphere at that conference was really ahead in many ways of this perestroika processes, because it was very open at that time. So the question is really not about, is it Gorbachev or Alexander Yakovlev? They took and did something. I think the question is that the history worked out, and the past history really brought us to that line when it was not possible to do things otherwise, and it was not possible to do things differently. So now, regarding the Soviet Union and all that was connected with the October Revolution. So in my life, when I was young, I was very, very pro-Stalin person. So when I was 16 years old, I came to Moscow, and a relative of mine was studying in the Communist Institute, and I lived in the dormitory and went for entrance exams. And so one of those days, I met one of neighbors of my relative. He was also one of the local leaders in wherever he came from. So we started arguing with him. So I am 16 years old, and he is the first secretary of Rayonic Committee of Communist Party. And so we're debating there. And he was not able to change my position with my Stalinist position. And it ended up so that he actually laughed and said, okay, I really, really want to meet with you a year from now. You will not, that we will be on my position, but I think you will be even more remote and more active. And I, of course, laughed at the time. And you will, as he said, essentially, he will be very, very against that. And I laughed at the time, but that's exactly what happened, because when I started studying in Moscow, when I started learning more, and I started learning more about how things happen and what happened, I had a very serious hobby. I started looking at and learning about biography and the people who were repressed and the people who were killed in 1937. How is the time? Yeah, I think let's come back to you later. Yes, thank you.
Isaac, go ahead.
Okay, so I have, Artemi has asked me to sort of summarize a little bit and to place some of these comments in the broader context, I think, of our sort of ongoing debate on Perestroika in Central Asia, nominally an academic debate, but I think as the comments from Khudonazarov and Sydykova have just shown, that this is a very live debate, right? And this is something that's not really restricted to the pages of academic journals or to our own circles of argument. And I think this is very important. And so my thanks as well to both of you, Davlat and Ambassador Sydykova. I'm very glad to see you here, and I was very glad to listen to your perspective on these years, because I think it's very important that we retain the liveness of this and understand how it continues to affect the region, and by that I mean both Central Asia and probably the post-Soviet space more broadly. So I have about 3 comments to make. They're all relatively limited, but places where I saw some overlap in these narratives and where they overlap as well with the academic discourse that we can read at the moment. And the first point of interest, I think, is the question of a movement of discourse, political and social at the time. So both speakers mentioned the idea of glasnost and openness, or this idea of freedom, also the influence of actors in Moscow and in the Baltics. And this is reflective in many ways of an ongoing, I think, debate about perestroika in the region, which is how much is it imported and how much of it is local, right? How much of the movements that are developing for change are reflective of a broader wave of movement across the USSR that may start in places like the Baltic republics and Moscow and move outward to the periphery, and how much of it has been driven by local political actors and local interests in, say, Bishkek or Dushanbe or Tashkent and other Central Asian capitals, primarily in cities, but we see it elsewhere in more rural areas too. Of course, this reflects, I think, Mark Bessinger's book from about 20 years ago, which I think quite effectively presented the position of a wave, and I think emphasized in many ways how it was coming out of the Baltics and Baltic movements in Moscow. But I think that there's been pushback against the sort of unidirectional movement in the literature recently. So you see a bit more focus on political parties as they were developing in Central Asian capitals and the particular reasons why local actors, as I think both of the speakers have mentioned, may have felt an initiative to push against the system, as it were, or to find ways of achieving change within the system. Right? So that these are two different ways to consider political action in the late Soviet system. And I'm also, I think it's important to bring out a point that Davlat Khudonazarov made at the end, which is that when you have movements for change in the late Soviet period, particularly in Central Asia, this often doesn't seem to mean a rejection of the Soviet state. It often doesn't seem to mean a rejection of fundamental Soviet ideas in ways that it did mean perhaps in Riga or in Moscow or in later stages perhaps in Kiev. But in Central Asia, there's a real ambiguity, which is to say, we have an issue with the way the Soviet state is operating, and we are asking for change within the system, but the movements for political change may or may not demonstrate a full push against the state or even a push for independence. So I think we need to think deeply about what has been said today about what is meant when a late Soviet parliament like the one in Bishkek or in Dushanbe says we are voting for suverenitet, right? There are these declarations of sovereignty that happened in 1990, or even the declarations of full independence, right? They may say nezavismist on paper, but what that independence means in the context of September or October, even 1991, needs to be really taken into consideration. So one sort of broad question for both speakers on this first point is, to what degree or how much do you think Central Asians' experience of perestroika, so the last few years, let's say 1989, 1990, 91, how different was this experience than the experience in Moscow? For you, for the people around you, is this fundamentally something different, or is it reflective of the standard that we hear from the Moscow perspective? So that's question one. The next point that I saw as being consistent is a general understanding of the influence of Gorbachev, right? The influence of central power and the idea that things changed fundamentally because, as both Ambassador Sydykova and Davlat Khudonazarov mentioned, you could in a way appeal to Gorbachev as a figure in a way that you couldn't before, right? And I think the story that Ambassador Sydykova told about how in the face of meetings, Gorbachev took the initiative to find a way out, but he took the way to find a way out that actually undermined the power of the Communist Party in Bishkek, right? By finding a wedge that would allow the presidency of the Kyrgyz Republic to be separate from the Communist Party. So Gorbachev's influence there is really fundamental. And I think we also saw that in Khudonazarov's comments when he said it was a different world because you could appeal to Gorbachev, right? That was never the case before, right? So Gorbachev as a singular actor seems to come out no matter the case. And I would also ask both speakers if they could to just comment a little bit more about Gorbachev, right? And his influence on both republics at the time, because I think that's worth considering in more detail too. And the last point that I wanted to make quickly is about the underlying conditions that may have led people in Central Asia to not only protest against the system, but ultimately to violence in ways reactive against the system. And Ambassador Sydykova made the point that in Kyrgyzstan, the experience was relatively smooth. And I think the point with that is in many ways a comparison, unfortunately, perhaps to Tajikistan, where certainly the transition to independence was not smooth, and where the consequences of the transition to independence were excessively violent. But we also see across Central Asia experiences of protests and rioting, and as was mentioned in Kyrgyzstan, land seizure. But all of these things are built in many ways, as was brought out also in the comments, on an underlying socioeconomic inequality. Across Central Asia, you have a divide between city and village. And the city and village divide inevitably has to do as well with an ethnic or national divide, because the cities are at least 50%, if not overwhelmingly, non-titular nationality, right? Their majority is, say, non-titular nationality speaking, right? So Dushanbe is not a fundamentally it's not a fundamentally Tajik-speaking city in 1990 or 89. Bishkek is a primarily Russian-speaking city at the time. So the socioeconomic division between the city and the village in Central Asia overlaps with an ethno-national division, and these things come together in these protest movements, right? It seems to be consistent. And so this is another place that I think is worth asking both speakers. Was once you have freedom, once Gorbachev has come in and changed the fundamental political considerations and the fundamental political balance, are these preconditions for struggle and strife too strong to overcome? Was it going to come out inevitably? Was there going to be some amount of social protest? Or was that the result of particular policies in particular places? And I think this also reflects a great deal of the literature that's currently being written about the period, which tends to often focus around particular events of violence, whether or not they are protests or the civil war in Tajikistan, or the early burgeoning, for example, of political parties in Uzbekistan, which then is pushed down and so forth. So this question of where does protest and violence come from? Is it socioeconomically driven? Is it policy driven? Is something that I think we could talk about a little bit more. So those are three general themes. I think if both of the speakers would like to comment in general on those or would like to answer the particular questions that I've posed, I think that would all be very fascinating.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Isaac. I just want to add two other things, and since we haven't seen any questions from the audience yet, I'll add these and then I'll turn it over back to Ambassador Sydykova and Khudonazarov. One, I mean, for Ambassador Sydykova, I thought it was really interesting that you spoke about being a journalist coming back from Moscow and then engaging with these protesters who are, as you put it, coming down from the mountains and who have frustrations with this urban-rural inequality and what they have access to. And I wonder, I mean, I wonder about your own position in this, right? Because clearly you're coming from a position as being at least partially Russophone and having the Moscow education. And I wonder, you know, also in kind of reaching out to those protesters, does that put you at odds with your editors? Does that put you at odds with your parents? How does this affect kind of your own position as a young journalist? And for Davlat Khudonazarov, you mentioned several times that your entry into politics is motivated by this desire to fulfill the expectations of people who put their trust in you and not to disappoint them. But I wonder, what is it? And you also kind of, you alluded to the fact that this is partially about your experiences being censored early on as a filmmaker within the Republic and your desire for greater freedom. But I wonder, you know, what did you want to do with these positions? Like, what did you think needed to be done as, you know, the head of in the Union of Cinematographers, in the Central Committee, in these positions to which you've been elevated in this period? What kind of visions did you have or develop? So maybe 2 minutes for each of you, and then depending on how many questions we start getting. So Ambassador Sydykova, since you spoke first, you can.
Ну, если можно, то я первым делом, что я сделала и что я поняла, что я должна сделать.
So the first thing that I understood when I came back from Moscow, and because I was a Russian-speaking person, as I understood, the first thing I have to do is I need to learn Kyrgyz language. And I actually learned it, and I started speaking Kyrgyz language because I started speaking with Kyrgyz who came from small villages, and of course they did not speak in Russian, and I understood that I just have to learn the language, and it's a really valid argument that they have. They want to speak with me on their own language, and I have to speak that language with them. And you know, I have to say, I accepted that their demands are very real and very grounded, because afterwards I started traveling more around the region, and I saw that really big divide and gap between, if you wish, the city and the village, right, as we say. And I really saw that they don't have access to many things, and to this day they even don't have, you know, after 30 years after the collapse of and how everything has happened, but even today they don't have this access to very basic things, and this gap still exists. This gap in today influences tremendously the political situation in the country, particularly in the Kyrgyzstan, and these movements and this demands that we see, they continue because of this divide. And I'm glad, though, that today we don't have this question of not the national per se, but this nationalist approach probably exists in some way, shape, or form on the other, but we do have a bit of a different approach. It's not about the language anymore, right? It's like we don't have quotas, for example, anymore, right? For Kyrgyz and Russian, we actually have a lot of opportunities for Kyrgyz language to flourish. Like, for example, right now you cannot get a job in the state, or you cannot be in deputy or president if you don't know the Kyrgyz language. So, like, let's say I probably wouldn't be able to be ready to be president right now, right? Because my language is not so good. But like, if I wanted to do it, I probably would have to take extra courses and really learn language more. But we have had and still have the leaders like Felix Kulov. He was not able to become a president because, for example, he was not able to pass that test for Kyrgyz language. So we've had all these points, and for example, for me, as you ask, how do I accept it, or how do I understood it? I understood it as that, yes, we do have to have our own independence. We have to have our own sovereignty. We have an opportunity to really develop as a perspective independent state, nation state, and what happens next, you know, it's a question of history, presence, and future.
You're muted. You're muted, Davlat.
Microphone.
Скопление разных вопросов.
So lots of different questions here, but we have very little time here. Because of the little time, I'd like to say, as a witness of that time, that even Baltic countries at that time, I don't think they thought about this complete change and complete separation from the Soviet Union. And why I know that, that's because at that time, I actually had a lot of connections and a lot of contact with filmmakers from very different republics at the time. And these questions, many of them were asked and discussed among deputies of the Soviet Union at the time. We felt that something has to be done, that the structure that has been in place before was not possible to sustain, and this union of filmmakers was transformed in May of 1991 into the Confederation of the Unions of Filmmakers. And in that confederation, we actually had representatives from Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia filmmakers. So as far as Central Asian republics are concerned, I don't think there was even a thought about the fact that they would be independent in that kind of a complete sense. I think independence is a very relative term. Independence means you have to be independent economically, politically, you have to have social justice in place. So it's not just about legitimization, right? It's about many other things. And again, I want to repeat myself here that the fact that the book is called kind of a violent collapse, I think it's a very, very fair term, because I was really a proponent of step-by-step change. I really wanted to see this true sovereignty and independence that we would come with time. So this should be not just about the republics themselves, but it has to be about the people's sovereignty. It has to be about people's independence. And in fact, I think it was important to consider how that independence can happen within the larger frame of one country. So maybe the step-by-step processes had to be done. You know, we saw, for example, the European Union creation in our eyes, and we saw that it was a very hard and long work to balance all these relations, to balance all these connections in the European Union. You know, after the elections today, you know, what would happen with the Europe? What if somebody will leave? You know, the most important value in EU was the fact, and is still the fact, that you have to get the consensus and you have to make sure that everybody agrees with the decision. In the Soviet Union, there were so many closed, kind of pushed back and away decisions. There were so many mining fields, if you wish, and territorial discussions in social and economical and political. It was just impossible, right, to have that consensus. It was just not there. But I was talking about with people who came back from prison, Bolsheviks, if you wish, you know, who came back from prison, whose colleagues were killed. So I'm not talking about 20th or 30th. I'm talking about the end of the 20th. So it was not Soviet. So it was not representatives of that early Soviet power. So there was really no union back already in 1920s. It was really not a union, right? It was just Soviet, anti-Soviet kind of dichotomy. So I'll just give you a very quick example. There was one guy who was back in the 1920s, was elected as a leader. So he came to Tajikistan, and exactly in 7 months, they sent just another person who did not know anything else about Tajikistan, person who was who messed up something in some other place. You know, he was just sent to Tajikistan. Already in 1929, the system was not comparable to anything that would be like a union-like system. It was not really connected to this idea of equality among the republics. So another element here was that the movement was a lot of times connected to the culture and to the culture and the ideas were really coming not just from the Russian Revolution. You know, Tajiks who were working in Tajikistan at the time, they said we had to learn Tajik language, and we had to learn the language as well. So one of the people who was in the beginning of the really forming the Tajikistan and Tajik Republic, these were the people who were very connected to the culture, and they learn not only Tajik language but also other languages of the region, and they talk with the languages of the Pamir Mountains. And Gorbachev really had this idea and understanding that we really need to connect to this connected. And so when Gorbachev was there, he really didn't have any of those Bolsheviks, if you wish, those terrible people, Bolsheviks, who were just sending people and you know, killing them. So Gorbachev was not really going with those Bolsheviks. You know, it was not really a step, you know, against something. I think he really wanted to just go away from that all. And we had this conversation with Gorbachev, even when we discussed satire with him or some comics, political comics that he had. I think it was very unfair. It was really difficult and unfair, I think, toward him to talk about him as the person who ruined the Soviet Union, because I think he was the one who really gave us freedom. He was the one who really gave us independence.
I'll just tell everyone we're in principle we're running out of time, but if anybody poses a question, we can stay for a few extra minutes. And the question, I'll read it out loud in English. Why did the progressive inter-fractional group of deputies not become the voice of conscience and common sense? Why did it so quickly fall apart after the death of academic Sakharov? And don't you think that this parliamentary fraction could have become an all-union group even after the collapse of the USSR? I think that, по-моему, этот вопрос был вам.
Еще раз.
Again, please.
На русском как раз вот в чате стоит. Почему прогрессивная межфракционная группа депутатов не стала голосом здравого смысла и совести? Почему она так быстро сформировалась после смерти академика Сахарова? Не считаете ли вы, что эта фракция могла стать общесоюзной группой даже после распада Союза?
Нет.
Artemy, we don't see this in the chat, unfortunately, in Russian. So, and I know when you read very quickly, I cannot translate quickly when you read it. So, переключитесь, пожалуйста, Артем, на русский канал и повторите вопрос на русском, потому что я не вижу его в чате, к сожалению.
Я слушаю.
Да, вопрос от Сулаймон Шохзада. Почему...
Я вас не слышу.
The translation is going.
Артем, скажите еще раз, у вас вопрос на русском, и я его просто повторю. На русском.
Become the voice of common sense and conscience. And why did it so quickly fall apart after the death of Sakharov? Could it not have continued on even after the collapse of the Union?
Теперь я понял. Значит, вопрос заключается.
Okay, so the question is why this group was dismantled. So this межфракtional group of deputies, it was really not dismantled. It was, how should I say, maybe 10 years ago. We had actually 20-year anniversary, if you wish. We did not have the higher committee, right? The structure of the United Soviet Union. We did not have the structure. We were just fundamentally physical people. It was really not connected to the death of Sakharov. The problem was a bit of a different character. Gorbachev was really didn't have any supporters, real true supporters in the Central Committee of Gorbachev. So those people who actually pushed him and talked about this were really not people who supported him and Gorbachev. They were really not communists in that sense. So they were the ones who became oligarchs and you know, capitalists, if you wish, afterwards. So these were not the people who really wanted to have communism, you know, and state of communism. People who were protecting him, they understood that they may lose their power, that they may lose their finances, and that's what it was all about. It was about the fact on how to stay in power and how to stay in possession of all these things that they have had, you know. So Gizait Marov, for example, Askarov, I don't remember that they were in that group. Maybe they were signed but didn't come. All these groups, you know, a lot of these people had very opposing views. A lot of times they were really a core of the real true political parties. I've been meeting with Yakovlev several times about that, and I kept talking with him that we really need a true core of the new party. The idea of the Communist Party, it was not there. It was not a party anymore. We really needed a few more active people who could get together and really have the common views and common political understanding. But there's really not possible to have a party when people have contrary, really opposing views. So this dismantle and kind of fall, if you wish, of Gorbachev was really not a conflict of Soviet times or conflicts of Soviet times. I would say these are the conflicts of before Soviet times. You know, it's from the 19th century and from the Romanovs power. It was just building and building and building. As soon as you give freedom, as soon as you give independence, you know, things have been happening really rapidly in developing. Like in our eyes right now, France has a very big tensions right now that are connected to the Australian nuclear submarine and nuclear ships building. So this would be something that we will have to watch. You know, they will have to find a way to negotiate. They will have to find a way to find through this conflict. It's a very difficult work. It's a very difficult process to negotiate between the two sides. I don't want to take too much time, but I think in principle, I think we could have defended the basis of that country in which all these republics were, and very slowly came to what, for example, European Union came to. So it's a sovereign and independent, but very connected and very interrelated and integrated and cross-pollinated, if you wish. So all these economic and political and social structures were really interconnected. And if we were going very slowly toward that, we probably would be able to find a way to really sustain those relationships because if we don't have them, we really can't do anything without them.
Isaac or I posed earlier, if there's something else you wanted to say before we close down.
Ну, во-первых, я себе не представляю, вы знаете, частью Советского Союза.
First of all, quite honestly, I can't really imagine to myself a part of the Soviet Union. I think the collapse of the Soviet Union was inevitable. And I think we have actually received a lot more than what we've lost. And I think every one of us had to be sovereign, independent, and had to have our own nation states. Even small ethnic group, even small people have to have an opportunity and the right to have their nation state and their own politics. In terms of economic development and economic possibilities, I think these are the different type of questions. These are already, resources questions. These are opportunities to cooperate, negotiate. But from the ideological point of view, I am sure that we had to get our independence. And I think it was at the right time in history. Just one thing I want to say that when we received comments from our first introductory comments, why in Kyrgyzstan we were able to have the smooth transition and in other countries they were not able to have it. And I would say Davlat also said that like Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, this was the question a lot of times, like even language, right? So Kyrgyzstan, when we started talking about this demands for Kyrgyz language and the ideas, and we started developing this national free movement and demands of the national character, if you wish, nationalistic character, if you wish, because in those other countries, Tajik countries was absolutely required. In Soviet and in Uzbekistan, they had to some things in place. They did not even have that question that we had in Kyrgyz. We did not have a Kyrgyz language as a required, for example, in our regular middle school. We really had that disbalance toward Russian. We really have had this change, even that was not observed in Tajikistan or other countries. Like in the cabinet of the Soviet Communist Party in Kyrgyzstan were coming from Moscow. It was a very strict control. We had a very weak secretary of Central Committee of Communist Party in Kyrgyzstan, who was always listening to Moscow, who was always kind of serving Moscow. And I think in Kyrgyzstan, why we really saw that, and we had that consciously, if you wish, it was not really coming down to us from somewhere else. I think it was really inspiring for us of what was been happening in Baltic countries, because we did see this precedent in the Baltic countries, and we actually had real needs and demands and values to get this and to demand this. And I think in some other countries, perhaps there was some sort of a way to save that right to solve some of the issues that they needed, local issues themselves. But in our case, we really didn't have anything of that. And our Communist Party in Kyrgyzstan just was not able to give us any opportunity to make any decisions.
To Isaac, to Davlat, Khudonazarov, to Ambassador Sydykova. Marlene, I'll turn the floor over to you to close out the session.
Thank you so much. It was just a wonderful discussion to have both the combination of your memories of that time, and we can see how vivid the discussion can be, and to have Isaac giving us the evolution of the scholarship. And I like seeing this interaction also between scholarship and those who were actors of this really incredible moment. And I hope we will be doing more research into these times while we still have people there to tell us all their impressions. So I wanted to thank everybody, our three speakers at Yomi, for organizing the events. Thank you all so much for being with us today, and we will continue having regular events celebrating the 3 decades of independence of Central Asia. Thank you all again. Be safe and hope to see you very soon. Thank you. Bye-bye. Спасибо всем.
Спасибо вам.
Спасибо.
Спасибо за приглашение.